The shell casing was the wrong shape. That was the first thing Fleet Analyst Sorveth noticed when she pulled the debris fragment from the scanning tray. Not the chemical signature, not the mass readings, not the fact that it had punched through 14 centimeters of Kreth-grade composite plating like the material had simply forgotten to exist. Those details came later. What stopped her, what made her set down her instruments and turn the fragment over in her manipulator appendages 3 times before she trusted her own perception, was the geometry of the thing. It was cylindrical, smooth on one end, crimped on the other, slightly deformed by impact, but the original shape was unmistakable. And at the base of that crimp, stamped into the metal in characters no Galactic Standard Translation matrix could initially parse, were 4 symbols. She photographed them, filed the report, marked the fragment, origin unknown. She was wrong about the last part. She just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks before that shell casing arrived in Sorveth's scanning tray, the Enduring Principle, a Vethali Conclave heavy cruiser, 4th class, 2.3 kilometers of ceramic-bonded hull and enough firepower to glass a continent, had been assigned to intercept and board a vessel that didn't officially exist. The vessel had no transponder signal, no energy signature that matched any catalog propulsion system. It had appeared on the edge of the Kareth exclusion zone, moving slowly, almost leisurely, on a trajectory that suggested either mechanical failure or complete indifference to the fact that the exclusion zone was, by unanimous conclave decree, forbidden to all non-member species. There were 12 non-member species in the catalogued galaxy. 11 of them were terrified of the conclave. The 12th had been admitted to first contact protocols only 19 months ago, were still in the probationary observation window, had no vessel in their registered fleet registry anywhere close to this region, and were, according to every psychological assessment filed by the Conclave's Xenobehavioral Division, not yet capable of this kind of independent action. Not yet capable was the phrase that would later cause a senior assessment officer to quietly request reassignment rather than face the review board. The Enduring Principle's commander, High Admiral Dreth Cobb, was not a creature given to doubt. He had commanded fleet operations for 31 years. He had overseen 2 first contact sequences, 1 hostile suppression campaign, and 1 event classified deeply enough that its designation was a sequence of tones rather than words. He looked at the sensor data on the unidentified vessel and felt something he didn't have a word for in Vethali, an unease that wasn't fear, wasn't tactical concern, but was somehow both. "Estimate on vessel class?" he asked. His tactical officer, Subcommander Vral, studied the readings with the methodical patience that had made her one of the best targeting analysts in the 4th Fleet. Unknown class. Hull mass is approximately 6,000 metric tons. Power output is... She paused. "Sir, the power output is inconsistent. It spikes irregularly. That suggests either a catastrophically failing reactor or a propulsion system we don't have in the library. Armament, none confirmed. We're reading some kind of external mounted structures, but we can't identify their function. They don't match any weapon system on record." Dreth Kov processed this. An unidentified vessel, no weapons on record, irregular power. Moving slowly, he made the decision he had made 100 times before. Intercept, hail them. What happened next took 11 seconds. Those 11 seconds would eventually require their own classified report, separate from the primary incident file, because the primary incident file was considered too strategically destabilizing to include them in full. The hail went out. Standard Conclave Intercept Protocol. Identify yourself, state your purpose, prepare for boarding. The response came back in Vethali. Grammatically perfect, accent neutral, with a vocabulary precise enough that it had clearly been composed by someone who had studied the language with serious intent, not simply run through a translation matrix. The voice on the channel was unhurried, almost pleasant. "Enduring Principle, this is Captain Yara Osei of the ESV Continuance. We're conducting a survey mission. We'll reduce speed to make boarding easier." Do you want us to cut engines entirely, or would you prefer we maintain station keeping? Dretkov stared at the communications console. They're offering to make it easier, Rawl said. Quietly. With an inflection Dretkov couldn't immediately classify. I heard. The ESV continuance cut engines entirely. It drifted. It waited. And Dretkov, with 31 years of fleet command and 2 first contact sequences behind him, felt that unnamed unease deepen into something that had a sharper edge. He sent the boarding team anyway. 12 soldiers, full environmental gear, weapons hot, because a vessel that volunteers for boarding is either completely harmless or it wants you inside it. And that question, which one was the continuance, was the first mystery. It would not be the last. It would not even, in the end, be the most disturbing. The boarding team's helmet recordings were the first thing Sorveth received when the Enduring Principles data package reached the Conclave Analysis Center on Veth Prime. She watched all 4 hours and 17 minutes of the footage before she watched anything else. She watched it 3 times. The continuance was not, by any military definition, a warship. That was what the recording showed. Cramped corridors, exposed conduit, equipment strapped to the walls with physical fasteners, actual mechanical fasteners, not magnetic or adhesive systems. The crew were humans, 8 of them wearing no armor, carrying nothing that the Conclave soldiers' sensor sweeps flagged as a weapon. Captain Osei met the boarding team in what appeared to be a common area, a table, mismatched chairs, a container of liquid that a spectrographic scan later identified as coffee, and a portable device playing music that the translation matrix couldn't categorize, but that the Conclave linguist on the team later described as rhythmically aggressive and somehow cheerful. Osei herself was a small woman by human standards, 1.63 meters, the record showed, with close-cropped hair and an expression that the xenobehavioral analysis flagged after considerable processing difficulty as relaxed. "Admiral sends his compliments," said the boarding team commander, of a Thali soldier named Karath Sol. He had been trained for hostile boarding scenarios. He had been trained for this. "That's kind of him," Osei said. She gestured at the chairs. "You want to sit? The coffee's bad, but the company's decent." Karath Sol did not sit. He conducted his inspection. His team moved through every compartment of the continuance, cataloged every system, scanned every surface. They found scientific survey equipment, geological sampling tools, long-range sensor arrays calibrated for stellar phenomenon mapping, food stores, personal effects, and in one compartment, a folded piece of paper with handwriting on it that nobody on the team could read. "What is this?" one of the soldiers asked, holding it up. Osei looked at it without approaching. "Grocery list," she said, "for when we get back." Karath Sol filed a report. Vessel was non-military. Crew was non-combatant. Vessel had entered the exclusion zone apparently without knowing it was restricted, and the crew had shown no hostility, no panic, and no behavior consistent with any threat profile in the xenobehavioral database. Dretkov read the report. He ordered the continuance escorted to the exclusion zone boundary and released. And then, because this was the moment that everything hinged on, the moment that the grocery list and the bad coffee and the relaxed captain all suddenly became something else entirely, he did one more thing. Standard protocol, routine. He ran a registry check on the ESV continuance through the human fleet database the Conclave had been provided as part of the observation agreement. The ESV continuance was listed as a geological survey vessel. Commissioned 8 years ago. Standard crew complement of 6 to 10. Operating range inner system only, the inner system of the Sol planetary body, which was, from where they were currently standing, approximately 2,400 light-years away. Dretkov looked at that number for a very long time. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "How did they get here?" That was the second mystery. And the answer? when it eventually came, was worse than the question. Sorveth was not supposed to be the analyst assigned to the continuance case. She was third-tier, deep background assessment, the kind of analyst who spent her time studying old data rather than live incidents. But the two senior analysts who should have handled it had both filed medical leave within 4 hours of receiving the initial brief, which was either a coincidence or was not, and by the time anyone noticed the assignment gap, Sorveth had already been 3 hours deep into the helmet footage and couldn't be reasonably pulled off. She was glad they hadn't tried, because what she found, buried in hour 2 of Karath Sol's helmet recording, was a detail that wasn't in his report. A detail so small that it was easy to miss and so strange that it was easy to dismiss if you did notice it. Sorveth noticed it in her second viewing and spent 40 minutes staring at it during her third. At timestamp 2014-2007, one of the human crew members, a young man, barely past the biological threshold for adulthood by human standards, sitting on a storage crate in the corridor outside the engine compartment, looked directly at Karath Sol's helmet camera. Not at Karath Sol, at the camera. He smiled. Then he looked away. The helmet camera was not visible from the outside. It was flush-mounted, recessed, designed to be indistinguishable from the suit material surrounding it. Karath Sol's own soldiers, in over 1,000 hours of joint training exercises, had never reliably identified its location. This human crew member, who was supposedly a geological survey technician on a vessel that couldn't possibly have traveled 2,400 light-years on any registered propulsion system, had found it in approximately 30 seconds. Sorveth filed her preliminary report. She marked 3 items for immediate escalation: the impossible range of the vessel, the propulsion system they couldn't identify, and the young man who had looked at the camera. She didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the smile. Drethkov's formal report on the continuance incident reached the Admiralty Council 6 days later. It was classified at the 3rd tier, significant, requiring response but not yet crisis level. The Council's position was cautious but not alarmed. The humans were new. They were primitive by galactic standards, barely out of their own solar neighborhood, still in the probationary window. There were rational explanations. Survey vessel with an unreported propulsion upgrade, said Admiral Primary Sesek, who chaired the council. We've seen other probationary species conduct unauthorized capability tests. The protocol is clear. We issue a formal notation, restrict their operating range, and increase observation density. With respect, said Drethkov, I don't believe that's sufficient. Based on what, specifically? Drethkov thought about how to answer that. He thought about the grocery list. He thought about Osei's unhurried voice on the comms channel, offering to cut engines. He thought about the way she had sat at that table and not looked worried, not looked defiant, not looked like anything he had a category for. Instinct, he said, with 31 years of weight behind it. Sesek regarded him with the particular expression of someone who respected competence and was choosing, in this moment, not to follow it. We'll note your concern, Drethkov. Increase observation. But we are not escalating on instinct. We have protocols. Drethkov said nothing. He left the meeting. In the corridor outside the council chamber, he stopped walking, stood still for a moment, and then said quietly, to himself, to the empty corridor, to whoever might be listening, they planned to be boarded. He didn't know why he was sure. He was sure. The second incident occurred 11 weeks later, and it was Sorveth who saw it first. She had been tracking human activity in the outer observation zones. Officially a background monitoring task, the kind of work you handed to 3rd-tier analysts because it was unlikely to produce anything. What she found was not unlikely. What she found was a ship she had never seen in any registry, moving on a vector that intersected with nothing on any known chart, broadcasting nothing, appearing on sensors for 47 minutes, and then vanishing so cleanly that 2 different system operators filed malfunction reports before anyone considered it might be the ship that had disappeared rather than the sensors. She pulled the sensor data. She ran it through the full suite. And then she sat very still for a moment before she picked up her communication relay and requested an urgent line to Dreth Kov's personal flag station. He answered on the second signal. It was the middle of his rest period. He sounded like someone who had not been sleeping anyway. "What is it, sir?" "The ship that just vanished from the outer Kareth sector. I've isolated its mass signature. It's 2.3 million metric tons. That's not a survey vessel. That's not anything we have a civilian category for." She paused, and I found a cross-reference in the deep background files. That mass signature matches a configuration that human naval records, the ones they gave us as part of the observation agreement, list as decommissioned. Decommissioned. 15 years ago, according to their own records. The silence on the line lasted long enough that she almost asked if he was still there. "Sorveth," he finally said, "in your assessment, how many vessels do you think we haven't seen?" She had already asked herself this question. She had spent 2 hours building probability models around it. She had 3 different answers depending on which assumption she used, and all 3 of them were deeply uncomfortable. "I don't know," she said. "That's what scares me." "File it, all of it. Mark it urgent." Another pause. "And Sorveth, don't share the specific figures with the wider analysis pool yet." "Sir?" "Because if I'm right about what this means, I need to be the one who tells Sessic. And I need to be able to walk out of that meeting room afterward." He paused once more. "If it becomes common knowledge before I reach him, someone else will deliver it, someone who doesn't have 31 years to put behind it. Someone who won't know how to say it so that he actually listens." She understood. "Yes, sir." She filed the report, marked it urgent. And then she went back to the sensor data, because there was still a detail that didn't fit, a loose thread in the mass signature readings, and she had learned 3 weeks ago, looking at a shell casing and a smile, that loose threads were where the important things hid. She found it 6 hours later. The ship that had vanished, the one with the 2.3 million metric ton mass signature, the one listed as decommissioned 15 years ago, had not vanished because of a stealth system. The sensor data, properly cleaned and reanalyzed, was clear. It had vanished because it had turned. The mass signature hadn't disappeared. It had reoriented. The ship was still there. It had rotated to present its minimum sensor profile, dropped to minimum power output, and become, for all practical sensor purposes, a very large, very dark piece of space. It was hiding. It was hiding in a region of the outer zone that happened to be adjacent to the Conclave's secondary munitions relay station. Not in orbit, not close enough to trigger proximity alerts, but adjacent in a way that required precise knowledge of the munitions relay station's sensor range, its detection thresholds, and the exact geometry of its blind spots. Sorveth stared at that geometric relationship on her display for a long time. Then she said to her empty office, to the shell casing still sitting in her scanning tray, "They're not exploring, they're mapping." This was the moment. This specific realization, filed in Sorveth's report at the 19th hour of what was becoming an involuntary research spiral, that later prompted a complete reclassification of every human contact event in the Conclave's records going back to first contact 19 months ago. Because once you understood that the continuance had been mapping, the grocery list looked different, the coffee looked different, the offer to cut engines looked different, the smile looked different. Every single interaction the conclave had logged with human representatives over 19 months, the diplomatic meetings, the cultural exchanges, the trade discussions, the carefully calibrated moments of apparent naivety that had reassured every psychological assessment team, all of it was suddenly a possible data collection event. They hadn't been learning about humans. Humans had been learning about them. The assessment teams had watched humans make diplomatic errors, stumble over protocol, ask questions that seemed too basic, express confusion about galactic power structures that any rational civilization at this stage of development should have understood instinctively. The teams had filed reports. Humans are intellectually limited, culturally insular, not yet operating at galactic norm strategic sophistication. They had interpreted human questions as ignorance. They had not considered that questions might be intelligence gathering. They had not considered that stumbling over protocol might be deliberate pressure testing. Seeing how the conclave corrected mistakes, seeing what the conclave considered important enough to correct. They had not considered that a species asking elementary questions might be a species that already knew the answers and wanted to see what you chose to say. Drethkov reached Sesek 4 hours after Sorveth filed her report. He walked into the council chamber, put the report on the table, and said 4 words before Sesek could speak. "We misread them completely." Sesek looked at the report. He read slowly. He was a careful reader, thorough, methodical. Drethkov had always respected that about him. He watched Sesek's face move through a series of expressions, dismissal, then consideration, then something that progressed toward a place Drethkov recognized because he had been there himself. "If this is accurate," Sesek said finally, "then for 19 months, yes. Every session, every exchange, every smile," Drethkov said. "Every question they asked us that seemed too simple." Sesek set down the report. He looked at nothing for a moment. Then he asked the question that would become the center of every subsequent analysis, every wargame simulation, every emergency strategy session for the next 7 months. How long have they been doing this? Not just with us. How long, across the galaxy, have they been? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "That," Drethkov said, "is the question I'm afraid to answer." The answer came from an unexpected direction. It came from the shell casing. Sorveth had never stopped working the fragment. While the wider analysis team scrambled to reprocess 19 months of diplomatic data, she kept coming back to the physical object in her tray. The wrong geometry, the 4 symbols, the deformed crimp. She had run the symbols through 67 different character sets before she found a partial match, an archaic human notation system out of common use for over a century, typically found in industrial manufacturing records. Not weapons manufacture, industrial manufacture. It took her a specialist linguist, a human cultural historian borrowed from the diplomatic department, and an obscure digital archive of pre-contact human commercial documents to reconstruct the meaning. The 4 symbols were a production code, a batch identifier, the kind of marking stamped on mass-produced components to track manufacturing origin and production date. When she finally decoded the date, she sat very still. The shell casing had not been manufactured recently. It had been manufactured 63 years ago. 63 years before first contact. 63 years before any human vessel had, officially, operated outside Sol's inner system. She pulled a trajectory analysis for the fragment, calculated backward from where the enduring principle had found it, based on micro-debris drift patterns in that sector. The fragment had been traveling for approximately, she ran the calculation 4 times, 41 years. 41 years ago, something had fired the shell in the Kareth region. Fired it hard enough to penetrate 14 centimeters of Kreth-grade composite, a composite that had not even been invented 41 years ago, which created a materials paradox she filed separately and which 3 different analysts later concluded was a measurement error rather than accept what it implied. Sorveth did not conclude it was a measurement error. She sent the full analysis to Drethkov with a single sentence of accompanying text, "They were here before us." His response came back in 40 seconds. 4 words, "How long before us?" Not a question. She knew what he meant. Not how many years before this specific incident. How long had humans been operating in galactic space before anyone knew to look? She didn't answer that message, because she had just found something else. The Continuance Captain Osei had been debriefed at the exclusion zone boundary by a conclave diplomatic officer before release. Standard procedure, 12 minutes of recorded conversation. The recording had been in the file the entire time. Sorveth had watched it on her first pass through the materials and noted nothing significant. Osei had been cooperative, appropriately apologetic about the boundary incursion, credibly uncertain about the exact position of the exclusion zone line. The diplomatic officer had been satisfied. End of recording. But Sorveth watched it again now, with different eyes. At the 4-minute mark, the diplomatic officer asked a routine question. "How long have you been conducting survey operations in this region?" Osei's answer, "This mission? 14 months. The diplomatic officer had accepted that. Had moved on to the next question. This mission, not this type of mission, not survey operations in general. This mission, this specific mission. 14 months. 14 months in a vessel with inner system only range. 2,400 light years from home. And the diplomatic officer had heard the words and had not heard what they meant. Sorveth's hands were shaking slightly when she flagged the timestamp. She was not a field analyst. She was not trained for this kind of work. She was a deep background researcher who had been handed a fragment of debris because 2 senior analysts had taken medical leave, and she had pulled a thread that had turned out to be attached to something she could not yet fully see. She opened a new document. She titled it using the Conclave's internal classification system with the code that meant active threat, strategic level, immediate escalation required. Then she started writing. The Admiralty Council met in emergency session 13 days after Sorveth's escalation report. Drethkov presented. Sorveth was brought in to answer technical questions, the first time a third-tier analyst had appeared before the full council in 40 years. She stood at the data terminal and answered every question they asked and did not look at her hands, which were still shaking. Sesek asked her directly, "Your conclusion is that human presence in outer galactic regions predates first contact. By how much? Based on the physical evidence? A minimum of 41 years. Based on the pattern analysis of what we believe are unreported contact traces in the border regions?" She paused. "I can't give you a ceiling on that estimate, sir. Every time I set one, I find something that pushes past it." The chamber was quiet in a way that institutional chambers rarely are. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next speaker, but the quiet of people adjusting to the size of something. An admiral she didn't know the name of leaned forward. "You're suggesting that for an unknown period of time, humans have been operating throughout galactic space without our knowledge, without detection, and apparently without our detection even being a concern to them?" "Yes, sir." "And the vessel in the Kareth region, the one that hid itself adjacent to our munitions relay?" "Still there," Sorveth said. "As of my last data poll, 6 hours ago. Still stationary, still in the blind spot." Another silence. "It hasn't done anything?" a third admiral asked. "In 11 weeks, it simply waited," Sorveth said. The words sat in the chamber like an object with weight. And then, because Drethkov had been in that chamber many times and knew exactly how long institutional courage lasted before it curdled into institutional denial, he said the thing he had come there to say. "We need to make contact. Not a boarding party, not an intercept, a formal diplomatic approach to the vessel directly. We need to tell them we know they're there." Sesek looked at him. "And if they respond, then we'll know what they want. And if they don't?" Drethkov thought of Osei's face. the relaxed expression, the bad coffee, the grocery list, the young man, and the smile. Then we'll know something worse, he said, that they don't feel the need to. The formal hail went to the hidden vessel the following morning. Conclave standard protocol, full diplomatic code, transmitted on every frequency in the vessel's estimated reception range. Nothing. They hailed again in the afternoon. Nothing. On the third morning, Sorveth was in her office reviewing the mass signature data when her console lit up with an incoming signal, not directed at the council, not directed at any diplomatic channel, directed at the analysis center, her specific terminal. She stared at the origin point. The signal was coming from the Karath region, from the blind spot beside the munitions relay. She opened the channel. Analyst Sorveth. The voice was human, female, unhurried. She had heard it before, in a recording, across a conference table, from the other side of a 12-minute debrief. "I owe you an apology," said Captain Yara Osei. "The grocery list was a bit much, wasn't it? We argued about that internally. I lost." Sorveth's voice, when she found it, came out steadier than she expected. "How long have you had this frequency?" "Since the second diplomatic session, 14 months ago." A brief pause. "You're very good, by the way. Most of what you filed in the last 2 weeks is accurate. The shell casing is a genuine artifact that one wasn't planted. We lost a ship there a long time ago." Sorveth processed that. A ship. Lost. Long ago. In the Karath region, decades before any human vessel was supposed to be within 1,000 light years. "How many ships?" she asked. "How many have you lost out here before we knew you were here?" The pause this time was longer. When Osei spoke again, the unhurried quality was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, not grief exactly, but the compression of something large into a controlled container. "Enough," she said. "Enough that we got very good at building ships that are hard to find." "Why?" Sorveth asked. "Why come out here at all? Why not stay in your system, develop at normal pace, wait for formal? Because we didn't know how long we had." Osei's voice was calm, completely calm, in a way that landed harder than anger would have. "We didn't know who was out here. We didn't know if someone was coming. We didn't know if we had a century or a decade. So we came out to look, quietly. Because if something was going to end us, we wanted to see it first." Sorveth thought of the exclusion zone, the munitions relay, the blind spot, the 11 weeks of waiting. "And now?" she asked. "What do you see now?" Another pause. "Something that might not want to end us," Osei said, "but doesn't quite know how to say so yet. Which is why I'm talking to you, Sorveth, and not to Sesek, because you're the one who actually wanted to understand. The Council wants to assess the threat. You wanted to know why." Sorveth looked at the shell casing in her scanning tray. She had been looking at it for 3 weeks. "The stamp on the casing," she said. "The production date. 63 years ago. How long before that did you start?" The pause this time stretched so long that Sorveth began to wonder if the channel had dropped. "I'll answer that," Osei said finally. "But I need you to understand something first. When I tell you the number, the instinct will be to feel afraid. And I need you to push past that instinct, because the fear is based on a misread, and we really can't afford another misread." Sorveth's hands were not shaking anymore. She didn't know why. Possibly because she had already accepted, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that the ground had been moving, and she had simply been getting used to the new position of it. "Tell me," she said. "The first human vessel to leave Sol System left 112 years ago," Osei said. "Before we had FTL, it was a generation ship. Took 37 years to reach the nearest star. The crew that arrived were the grandchildren of the crew that departed. And," Sorveth said, because she could hear that there was more. They found something there, Osi said. A probe. Not human-built. Old enough that our best dating systems couldn't bottom out the age. Just sitting there, in orbit, watching. Sorveth's console was very quiet. We've never told the Conclave about that probe, Osei said. Not because we were being deceptive, but because we wanted to understand it before we introduced it as a diplomatic variable. We wanted to know if the Conclave built it, if it was someone else, if it was still transmitting to anyone. Is it? Sorveth asked. Still transmitting? Yes, Osei said. That's actually why we're parked next to your munitions relay. We needed to use your sensor infrastructure to triangulate the transmission target. We've been trying to do it politely, quietly, without causing a crisis. I realize in retrospect that parking an unmarked warship in your blind spot for 11 weeks may not have been perceived as polite. Sorveth looked at the shell casing, at the 4 symbols, at the wrong geometry of the thing. Something enormous was becoming clear to her, not all at once, not with a sudden shock, but in the way that a shape emerges from fog when you've been standing still long enough, gradually, completely, and in a way that makes you understand you were never going to see it from moving. The continuance hadn't been mapping the Conclave's defenses. Not primarily. The vessel in the blind spot hadn't been positioned to threaten the munitions relay. Not primarily. They'd been using Conclave infrastructure as a listening post. They'd been parked there for 11 weeks, stationary, minimum power, because that was what the triangulation required. Patient, quiet, waiting for the signal to complete its arc across enough reference points to be properly mapped. And the signal was going somewhere. Somewhere the Conclave didn't know about. Somewhere that a probe, old enough that human dating systems couldn't find its bottom, had been transmitting toward for long enough that there was no record of when it started. Analyst Sorveth, said Osei, and her voice was very careful now. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Yes. The Conclave has been the dominant power in this region of the galaxy for approximately 400 years. In that 400 years, have you ever found anything, any artifact, any probe, any signal that wasn't built by a species currently in the Conclave or currently cataloged as a known non-member? Sorveth thought of the case files she had access to. The deep background archives, the things that had been quietly classified rather than processed, because processing them meant confronting implications that institutional structures weren't designed to confront. She thought about the senior analysts who had taken medical leave rather than work the continuance file. I need access to a higher classification tier to answer that, she said. I know, Osei said. Which is why I'm talking to you instead of Sesek. You'll go find out, Sorveth. I know you will. And when you find out, you'll call me, because you're not someone who sits on information that size. And when you call, Osei said, we should probably have the real conversation. The one about what's actually out there and whether the Conclave and humanity might want to stop circling each other and start comparing notes. The channel stayed open. Neither of them spoke. In the Kareth region, 2.3 million tons of ship that had been listed as decommissioned 15 years ago held its position in the blind spot beside a Conclave munitions relay running on minimum power, waiting with the particular patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned to be good at it. Sorveth looked at the shell casing one last time. The wrong geometry, the 4 symbols. 63 years old, but the ship that had fired it had been in the Kareth region 30 years before that, and humans had been moving through this galaxy for a century before any Conclave sensor thought to look. She thought of what Osei had said, enough that we got very good at building ships that are hard to find. She thought of the probe, old enough to have no dating floor, transmitting to a destination not in any Conclave chart. She thought of all the things that had been classified rather than processed, all the things that institutional structures weren't designed to confront. She thought we were watching them. We thought the probationary window, the observation protocols, the diplomatic assessments, we thought all of it was us studying them, learning their limits. She picked up the shell casing. She turned it over one more time. Then she set it down deliberately, like a period at the end of a sentence, and opened a new authorization request for a higher classification tier. She would find what the conclave had quietly buried. She would call Osei. And then they would have the real conversation. But even before she made that call, even before she found what was in the higher tiers, which she already suspected was going to be something that reframed everything she thought she understood about the last 400 years of galactic history, one thought settled in her mind with the quality of something permanent. Something that, once understood, couldn't be ununderstood. The conclave had looked out at the galaxy for 4 centuries and concluded they were the most sophisticated force in it. They had built that conclusion on evidence, on cataloged species, on a history of successful dominance. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was the conclusion that all the data seemed to support. But they had never once found a species that had sent scouts a century before admitting it existed. They had never once found a species that lost ships in secret and called that education rather than defeat. They had never once found a species that had watched a probe of unknown origin for 100 years and hadn't screamed the news across the galaxy, that had instead quietly gotten better at traveling quietly, gotten better at listening quietly, gotten better at being somewhere while appearing to be nowhere. They had never once found a species that looked at an incomprehensible ancient signal and thought, we should understand it before we tell anyone about it. Not caution, not paranoia, something older than both. Something that had been shaped over 100 years of sending ships into the dark and not knowing if they would come back. Something that had been shaped by a species that had looked up at an empty sky for all of its history and simultaneously felt alone in it and refused to believe the feeling was accurate. They had found the probe and they had not been afraid of it. They had been interested. The conclave had encountered thousands of species. Many were stronger. Many were faster. Several had technologies that still had no clear analog in conclave engineering. None of them had done this. The galaxy had many powers. It had species that could crack planets, species that could fold space, species old enough that the concept of memory as a linear record had become physiologically irrelevant to them. What it did not have, what Sorveth understood, it had never had in all the catalog breadth of everything the conclave had ever encountered, was a species that treated the unknown not as a threat to be assessed, not as a resource to be evaluated, but as a question to be answered, whatever the cost, over whatever the time, without anyone watching, without anyone ever needing to know. In the blind spot beside the munitions relay, the warship waited. It had been waiting a long time already. It was very good at waiting. And somewhere further out in a direction no conclave chart described, a probe that should not exist was sending a signal to a destination that no one in this part of the galaxy had yet found. But someone was looking, had been looking for a century, and they were getting closer.